Hello and welcome to the Inner Core. My name is Paul Rauschenbusch, and I am the Associate Dean of Religious Life in the Chapel here at Princeton University. I am so honored and pleased to welcome today to this table Vice President of Campus Life, Janet Dickerson, who is, much to many of our lament, retiring this year. 2010 will be her last year in the academic world, but not the last year of her many, many occupations. We're looking forward to hearing about that. But first of all, I want to welcome you to the Inner Core, and I want to say, just by introduction, how inspiring it has been to work with you over these last years. Since I've been here, you were part of the group that hired me, and I thank you so much for that, let me say publicly. But also just that you have created space on this campus for good conversations about what do we value.
Yes.
And I was wondering, just by way of introduction, how do you think that conversation is best carried out? How does the Office of Campus Life, and it includes, civic engagement, it includes athletics, it includes healthiness,
yes.
It includes the Office of Religious Life, where I'm located. I'm forgetting other things.
Dean's office.
Oh, yeah, the Dean of Students' office, of
yes.
course. I mean, it's just a
yes.
wide range. How do we have a conversation about what does it mean to be a well-rounded student at an American university today? Just a small question for us to start with.
Well, Reverend Rauschenbusch, I was going to say, that is not a small question. It's a great question.
It's a great question.
Yes.
It's something that all of us are wrestling
yes,
with. So
right, all the time. Well, I'll start by saying that it's a real honor for me to be here today. At least I think so. You'll see how this interview goes. But so conversations, some of the deepest conversations take place in the quietest spaces or the most out-of-the-way places. Certainly the classrooms are a wonderful location for a certain kind of learning. And our students are probably more cognitive than many young people in our society at this point, and they think deeply. But we also know there needs to be space for other conversations. In fact, I think many of the conversations that they have start on the community action trip that they might take as they enter freshman year, or the outdoor action trip, or other informal ways of making connections. We know when we assign roommates that we're hoping to have students who have compatibility when it comes to conversation, as well as living habits, so that there can be some good talk there, both between the roommates, but also in Z groups and with their RCAs, or residential community or residential college advisors, they're called. So we think that it's important for students to have locations for conversations. One of the very intentional ways that Princeton has designed campus life and residential life is that we build them around residential colleges where it is expected that students will eat common meals in dining halls, and that there will be time set aside for thoughtful conversation, and that there may be opportunities there for there to be faculty as well as deans and students whom they might not otherwise encounter, to take the time to enjoy not only a nice healthy meal, but a chance to have a discourse over that informal setting.
So finding spaces. What do you think a student? What kind of progression do you expect a student to have for their 4 years here? I mean, what is it? A variety of different experiences? Is it sustained periods of continuity? We have some students who enter as on an athletic team and stay all 4 years with that team. I did that in undergraduate. I was a swimmer. And I was a bunch of different, I had all sorts of different communities, but one of them was really my athletics. And I think there's all sorts of different ways to learn that are outside of the classroom that complement the classroom.
Well, I think I'm going to conduct this interview and ask you more questions about your story, because I fully agree with what you're saying, and I know if you were a swimmer on your team, was it a varsity team?
Yeah.
That may have been one of your primary areas for connection and contact. But I expect that, like many of our students here, that's just one of multiple
Right.
affinity groups that you might have chosen to become part of. Certainly at Princeton, we encourage students to find their favorite affinity groups and make connections, and then find ways to leave them as well.
Right.
You know, so being a swimmer gives you one sort of satisfaction. It's competitive, it's affirming, it's rewarding when you win especially. It requires commitment and discipline. On the other hand, there may be some other spaces that students would be encouraged to search for those who might have experiences unlike their own. One of my favorite groups on campus is a group called Sustained Dialogue, which invites students as well as faculty or staff members to come together over a meal. We do a lot of things over meals
Right.
at Princeton. I think a couple of times a month to talk about who they are and why they have chosen, you know, what their background is, why they've chosen the path that they're on, sharing that with other people in a way that might both inform the other, but be a way to affirm those elements of one's identity that make a person special. And that's something that can go for a semester or, in the best of worlds, for at least a year or more.
Yeah. I think part of what Sustained Dialogue does, and just being in community with people who are different than you,
Yes,
it also challenges you.
It does.
And part of what happens at a place like Princeton is that people get challenged.
right. We get to examine our values. I know
Right.
when I left my home in South Carolina, and I was from a pretty rural county in an environment that was, I would say, we were a devout Christian community in my neighborhood. I went to a college where there were people from many different faith backgrounds, many of whom asserted that they were, you know, not a member of any faith. It was quite an awakening for me to just make connections with students whose lives we were in the same cohort as far as age is concerned, but at the same time we might have had very different experiences. And that was, I would say, amplified when students came from different cultures altogether. I went to a school that was very international, for example.
Which school was this?
It was a small college. It no longer exists, so that's why I say it was.
Uh-huh.
Small college in Ohio. It was called the Western College for Women. It's now part of Miami University of Ohio. But Western College had probably about 500 undergraduates when I was there. But there were 65 or 70 different countries represented, as well as most of the states. So, you know, I had classmates from Hawaii and Klamath Falls, Oregon, and you know,
Right. So you were in this situation.
Yes.
Was there ever a time when you were like, these people are just wrong? I mean, I'm just because
Yes.
I think a lot of times we get into, and this is about. I mean, I think in some ways what I describe Princeton as
Yes.
is a privileged but a microcosm of the world
Yes.
where people are coming together and
Yes.
bumping up against people with whom they very much
Right.
disagree.
Right. Well, I would say, as I reflect back on my college experience, and those listening in the audience should know, I graduated from college 45 years ago, so this was definitely in a different generation. And I had come not only from a sheltered Christian community, a very small minority group. There were maybe 6 African American women in my class, many students from other backgrounds. So while I didn't necessarily say to myself, these people are just wrong, I discovered that there were many things about other communities and cultures that I just didn't know. Many values that I had a hard time accepting and coming to terms with. You know, I had not really had a conversation with a person who was out as lesbian or gay before I was in college, and my academic advisor was an out lesbian, and she wrote about it. She was also a poet and a brilliant teacher, and You know, we had...
Wow, that must have been, I mean...
It was profound.
And I think that that's really
profound.
something that happens to a lot of students. And, you
Yes.
know, in all different ways.
Yes.
Really coming to
Right.
grips with, well, what does it mean to meet
Exactly.
another person in such a close proximity?
Right.
Because you're together for 4 years. You
Yes.
don't just, you know, you can't just say, well, see, I don't want to be around you.
Well,
you know, the
indeed.
campus is only so big.
Yes. Well, before marriage, one could say, or before, you know, one is in a committed relationship, college is probably one of the most intimate encounters
It is.
young people have. Because we're sharing, in most cases, common bathrooms. In most places, including Princeton, we design our freshman year program so that students have roommates. We know that there are some students here who don't have roommates, but the majority of our first year students have roommates. And while we are seeking to put students together who have compatible lifestyles and habits, we also know that we're trying to introduce that element of difference that will make a student be more open to examining one's own world and one's own culture and one's own values, as well as to understanding those of others.
And that's exactly when I talk about the work that we do in the Office of Religious
Yes.
Life. It's like I want students to really ask themselves the questions, what do I believe?
Right.
But also to ask the questions, what does my roommate believe?
Right.
And to be able to really have that kind of conversation. And then what do those beliefs have to do with our academic studies and
Right,
our desires
absolutely.
for how we live our lives? So from this small,
Yes.
not such a small college, you went on to what was your next destination? I
Yes.
want to take us through your life.
My whole thing?
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
my goodness. Yes. Well, I'll say a couple of other things about my college. While I was in college, part of the beauty and the elegance of my undergraduate education was that between my junior and senior years, I went on one of our college seminars. I went to the Middle East with a group of faculty members and other students, including this faculty member that I spoke about, who, by the way, was also Jewish, and that was an important learning for me. But we went to 17, I think, destinations in the Middle East and in Europe and in Scandinavia. So that was a remarkable journey. It was my first trip outside the United States and really helped me understand that my identity as an American was probably the most significant aspect of my identity, even
Isn't
though,
that interesting?
you know, this idea of being a minority is a definition that was put on me by my American community. And I was probably seen that way in many ports in Europe and in the Middle East, but not in all ports. And for a few weeks, you know, I was able to recognize that people weren't looking at me as African American or black. They were looking at me as female, certainly, but also as an American. After college, I got married and I went to work. I was working in an inner city school in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was quoted in a recent article as saying that, you know, I hated teaching because the students weren't prepared for learning. And in reading that comment that I'm sure I made, I realized that what I probably should have said is that I wasn't as prepared to teach them and as ready to encounter their difference as I probably should have been. And that's, I think, a challenge that we have when we are educated in what students here at Princeton call the bubble, where we are treated as elites in many ways and encounter others from an experience that is not the kind of experience you get when you're entering into an inner city school. And so that was a challenge. I took advantage of that challenge to both go back to graduate school to learn more about teaching, but then to prepare myself to be a guidance counselor. Because all my life, up until that point, which was maybe, I was 23 at the time, so I was not that old, but I had thought, you know, I didn't have a counselor when I was in my historically black school in South Carolina, and I thought it would be useful to have opportunities to work with students about the issues outside the classroom that might either inform or impede their development as scholars.
I want to interject here. Now,
Yes.
that sounds like that sounds like you wanted to have kind of a pastoral relationship with them, and I want to mention that
Yes.
what is important to realize is
Yes.
that Vice President Dickerson comes from a line of pastors,
Yes. Yes,
we
I
had
do.
the privilege of inviting Vice President Dickerson to preach in the University Chapel, and she started with a wonderful 6 words, I guess it's called an epitaph,
Yes.
from her grandfather?
Great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather, that said,
Passing through, he preached the gospel.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so, with that
Yes.
pastoral,
Yes.
and it seems like I think a guidance counselor, we owe a lot
Yes.
to guidance counselors.
Yes. Well, and I thought that would be my life calling, and perhaps as a dean, I've
In some ways, it
made
has
it
been.
happen.
Yeah.
But I worked in Cincinnati schools as a guidance counselor for a while, and then I taught very briefly for one summer at the University of Cincinnati, a combination of teaching English to incoming students, but also helping to prepare students for the transition from inner city schools to college. And then my husband got a different job, and we moved to Richmond, Indiana, and his job was working in a high school, but I was invited to come, I would say as a trailing spouse, to become, to work as a counselor on the campus at Earlham College, which is a small, really wonderful and far-reaching
wonderful college.
Quaker-related
Yeah.
college. And that was a transformative experience for me in the same way that my undergraduate experience had been. So I was a counselor for a year, and then they invited me to become a dean, an assistant dean, in order to not only work with individual students and their issues, but to also think about campus culture and ways we might help prepare the culture for the change that was taking place. This was in the early 1970s when many schools were going through remarkable changes. Both Earlham was already a coeducational school, but we were bringing in more students of color, more students from cities, more students with special needs. We didn't even necessarily know to call it special needs at the time. We were working to build our health services and counseling service capacities, and so it was a great opportunity for me to learn about being a dean. I should have said that as an undergraduate I worked very closely with my dean of students, Ms. Phyllis Hoyt, who is still a role model and mentor for me. But I was a leader on my own campus. So this came
Isn't it important? I want to
pretty
stop there
naturally
because I think that's a role that you have provided
Yes.
for many students.
Yes.
Now students have had an experience of working with you
Yes.
and having an experience of what it means to go to an adult and be
Yes.
taken seriously.
Yes.
And that's what some of the students at your party were saying, is that with Vice President Dickerson, if you go there, you feel heard.
Yes.
And sometimes that's what, even if you can't solve the problem for
Right.
them, if students feel heard,
Right.
then they feel that maybe this community, there's a place for them.
Right.
And that's very important.
And if they, I mean, one of the things that I have been told that I do well and I enjoy doing, I appreciate the compliment, is listening, which is a very, very important skill for all of us to have, because students will tell you what they need to tell you if you just listen. But I think what happens is that they get to listen to themselves as well. Many years ago, a colleague of mine gave me a quotation from William Butler Yeats, and I can't cite the quotation exactly, but it speaks about making one's mind so much like a mirror that others will see themselves in your presence. And I think I've tried to do that. And so by listening and encouraging, I help students see that there's a way to resolve any challenges that they might face. It might not be the way that they initially imagined, but you know, one of the things that's great about being in our society, being talented students, having the gifts of creative imagination as well as critical thinking, is that I think we can resolve problems. We can reconcile issues. We don't have to feel stuck anywhere. We're not stuck in our families. We're not stuck in an institution. We're not stuck in our jobs. You know, there's a way to make life work that will work in your to your advantage if you only think about it. And perhaps that is pastoral in a way, going back to what you said. And I do think of myself in many ways as doing pastoral counseling, particularly in the most difficult circumstances, when there's been a crisis, a death, a serious accident. You know, we all come together in those times.
That's right.
And this is where I really value and appreciate the presence of our chaplains and other members of the faith community on campus who are able to listen and support and comfort people when things haven't worked out the way that they had expected or hoped that they would work out.
Tragedy.
Yes.
Yeah. And after Earlham, I just want to make sure that we get to Princeton somehow.
Oh, okay.
You know, the arc of the arc of history bends towards justice.
Who knew?
Who knew? So you went next to Swarthmore? Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay.
I was at Earlham for 5 years. I made a personal transition. That is, I got a divorce. I had 2 daughters. We made the trek across the you know, Ohio and New Jersey turnpikes. We came north. Actually, I had thought I was going north when I went to college. It's only after I got to southern Ohio and crossed the Ohio River did people remind me that while it was maybe north of the Ohio River, it was not the Northeast. But I had family in the New York area, and I wanted to be closer to them, and I wanted to give my daughters the opportunity for a multicultural community environment. And Philadelphia is only 11 miles north of Swarthmore. So I got it. We got in our car with our cat and all about much of our belongings as we could put in there. And I went to Swarthmore as an associate dean and director of supportive services at Swarthmore Colleges. And I was there for 15 years.
Now, Swarthmore, this is very interesting because after Swarthmore you went to Duke. And when I think of Swarthmore, I think of like super intellectual.
Yes,
and
that's
I think of Duke, I think of super athletic. Now, am I just stereotyping both those places?
Well, I mean, you have one part of the stereotype of both Swarthmore and of Duke. Swarthmore competes in Division III, but, you know, their soccer team did really well last year. On the other hand, when I was at Swarthmore, we had a football team. They no longer have one. And I think they were, at a certain point, holders of the record for the most loses.
Oh, well, McAllister, where I went,
we
competed with Swarthmore in that case.
But Swarthmore has a strong athletic program with squash and lacrosse and basketball. A lot of good
so I stand corrected. But
on the other hand, there were elements at Duke that were highly intellectual too. I was very impressed by the students whose interest in the science led them to study in the School of the Environment or to do internships at the medical school. It was a big difference. Frankly, I probably knew vaguely about March Madness before I went from Swarthmore to Duke. But
you didn't realize how much of part of your life it was going to become.
I was immersed in March Madness once I got to Duke. And it was fun most of the time, although it had its challenges too, because one of the things that deans do and vice presidents do at places like Duke is try to help students learn how to have fun celebrations without jumping into bonfires. So there was some risks involved with that. But I loved both places.
Yeah. And what do you think is, you know, having been in all of these different environments, what is the constant about what should students? One of the things I'm working on, I think in my own work right now, is how do we have conversations about what constitutes a life that people really will feel like they are living well and living, you know, not only a good life in the sense of materially, but fulfilling in terms of a career, in terms of family. How are we helping students to think about those questions and what they really want and what are, you know, and I think that I recently gathered 20 students to seniors, so 20 seniors to really just talk about that.
Yes.
You know, what kind of life do you want to lead and what decisions will lead you to that life?
Right.
And
it's a wonderful conversation.
It is a wonderful conversation. It was profound. I asked each of them to bring a book that had had informed that question for them, inside or outside of the classroom, that they had read Wall at Princeton.
Yes.
20 very different books.
Interesting.
And I'm just wondering, like, how would you suggest, having been in all these different environments with their different reputations, I mean,
Yes.
those are four very different
Very
institutions.
distinctive institutions.
Distinctive institutions.
All smart.
All smart. They all, I mean, they have
Yes.
similarities.
Yes.
In fact, maybe more similar than
Yes.
different. But what is the commonality about getting to that question? Because I think and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, campus life in some ways is about that question.
Yes, the big questions.
The big question,
Yes.
and helping students to gain skills to answer that question, to
Right.
live out that question wherever they go.
Well, I think I have several responses, all of which are just maybe pieces of responses. But one is, I think students are looking at us. They're seeing how we are living our lives, and we are role models for them. And if we are stressed out all the time and working constantly and, never doing what we love and always complaining, that won't be the greatest model for them. I think what I like to tell students is to consider what they're passionate about, what special areas of giftedness they have, and what drives their economic engine. And if they can identify those things, they can think about a life work. They can think about their calling.
What's an economic engine?
Some people need money to be satisfied or fulfilled. All of us need some money, but some people, really enjoy doing work that may not generate, if it's nonprofit work, like we do, it may not generate high income, but it can make them feel like they are making contributions in
But even
one way
to be
or another.
aware.
To be aware of that,
you know,
right? Yeah. But most importantly, think about that you're passionate about. Because if you do what you love, the money will follow. I like to tell a story about my daughter who, when I told her that, and she was close to being a college graduate, she said, "Mom, I love television. I love soap operas." And I said, "Oh my goodness, I've sent you to college to love soap operas? That wasn't what I had in mind. But if you love soap operas, I asked you the question, that's the answer you gave me, that's fine. We can work with that, because soap operas is the way a lot of young people get their they get their insights about life. They're learning. I mean, if their literacy skills are weak. Now, I don't know anybody in soap operas, so I can't help you with a job like that, but maybe if we can get you to Hollywood, you can get started, and you can find out how you can get into television. And she never did get into soap operas, but she's now producing reality television.
Yeah.
And
I think that's, unfortunately we're going to have to close, but
Yes.
I think that question, what do you love?
yes, what do you love?
And how can that continue to guide you
Yes.
through your life?
Yes.
And in the various junctures.
Yes.
And that means family, that means everything.
Right.
What do you love, and how can you
Right.
guide your life through love?
Yes.
And I think that just in closing, and I could talk to you for hours, and
Yes.
and I appreciate you being willing to sit down with me. But in closing,
right.
I just, by way of blessing, I hope that you will follow what you love after
Yes.
Princeton, and know that you always have a loving home here
Yes.
among many of us in our hearts, and also at our table side. So.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and also to have been a part of this beloved community for these many years. It's been a privilege and an opportunity for me to think more about what the next chapter of my life will bring. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to the next time seeing you here on The Inner Core.